Chapter 3. He was sitting on the flat stone that served as a doorstep, waiting for his supper to cook. The late sun slanted in long yellow bars across the clearing. The forest beyond was already in shadow. Matt was feeling well pleased with his day. That morning he had shot a rabbit. He had skinned it carefully, stretching the fur against the cabin wall to dry. Chunks of the meat were boiling now in a kettle over the fire, and a good smell came through the door that made his mouth water. In the dimness of the trees, a darker shadow moved. This time it didn't disappear, but came steadily nearer. He could hear the crackle of twigs under heavy boots. Matt leaped to his feet. Pa? No answer. It wasn't his father. Of course. It couldn't be. An Indian? Matt felt a curl of alarm against his backbone. He stood waiting, his muscles tensed. The man who came tramping out of the trees was not an Indian. He was heavy-set, the fat bulging under a ragged blue army coat. His face was almost invisible behind a tangle of reddish whiskers. Halfway across the clearing, he stopped. "Howdy!" he called cheerfully. "Hello?" Matt answered uncertainly. Was this someone who ought to be greeted like a deacon? The stranger came closer, so that Matt could see the small blue eyes that glittered in a weather-hardened face. The man stood deliberately taking his time, looking over the cabin and the cornfield. "Nice place you got here." Matt said nothing. The man peered curiously over Matt's shoulder through the open door. He could see that the cabin was empty. "Y'all alone here?" Matt hesitated. "My father's away just now." "Be back soon, will he?" Matt was puzzled by his own unwillingness to answer. He ought to be glad to see anyone after all these days alone. But somehow he wasn't. He didn't quite know why he found himself lying. "Any time now," he said. "He went back to the river to get supplies. He might be back tonight. When I saw you comin', I thought it was him." "I guess I surprised you. Reckon you don't get much company way off here." "No, we don't," Matt answered. "Then your pappy wouldn't want you to turn away a visitor, would he?" the man asked. "Thought maybe you'd ask me to stay for supper. I got a whiff of it half a mile off." Matt remembered his manners. The man's easy grin was beginning to wipe away some of his doubts. "Of course," he said. "Come in, sir." The man snorted. "Ben's the name. You may have heard of me in the river town." "We didn't stay in the town very long," Matt answered. He hurried to light the candle. The stranger stood inside the door, taking in every inch of the small room. "Your pappy knows how to build a good house," he said. "You reckon on staying here for good?" "It's our land," Matt told him. In the candlelight, the room looked snug and homey, something to be proud of showing off to a stranger. "My mother and sister will be coming soon." "More folks coming all the time," the man said. "There was a time when you could tramp for a month and never see a chimney. Now the town's spreading out from the river in every which way." His eye fell on the rifle hanging over the door. He let out a slow, admiring whistle and walked over to run his hand along the stock. "Mighty fine piece," he said. "Worth a passel of beaver." "My father wouldn't sell it," Matt said shortly. He was busying himself to make the stranger feel welcome. He scooped out a good measure of flour, stirred in some water, patted the dough out on a clean ash board, and propped it up in front of the fire to bake. He laid out 2 bowls on the table and 2 pewter spoons. He poured molasses into 1 pewter dish, and then ladled hot stew into the bowls. The way that stew disappeared, the stranger couldn't have eaten a meal for a while. Matt took a very small share for himself. He pulled back his hand and watched the man snatch up the last bit of corn cake, sopping up the last of the molasses with it. Finally Ben pushed back his stool and drew the back of his hand across his beard. "That was mighty tasty, son. Mighty tasty. You wouldn't have a mite of tobacco now, would you?" "I'm sorry," Matt said. "My father doesn't have any." "Pity. Can't be helped, I suppose." And in an easy silence that followed, Matt decided to ask the question of his own. "Are you traveling to the river?" Ben snorted again. "Not likely. I'm keeping as far off from the river as I can, till things quiet down." Matt waited. "Tell the truth, I got away from that town just in time. Weren't nothing they could prove, but they sure had it in for me. So I says, 'Ben,' I says, 'you been planning on getting yourself some beaver pelts. Looks like now's the time to get moving. I am dissevelin' the redskins a bit, maybe move on north.'" "You mean you're going to live with the Indians?" "Could be worse. I could bed down about anywheres." It certainly looked as though, invited or not, Ben was planning on bedding down right here in the cabin. He had eased himself off the stool, sprawled out on the floor, his shoulders propped up against the wall. He pulled a dirty corncob pipe from his pocket and stared down at it ruefully. "Pity," he said again. "Meal like that needs a bit of baccy to settle it, right?" He put the pipe away and shifted his heavy bulk against the wall. "When I was not much more'n your age," he drawled, well fed and ready to talk, "I'd spend the whole winter with the redskins. Hunt with 'em, trap, easy to pick up their lingo. Still remember a good deal of it. But this country ain't the same any more. You got to go west, Ohio maybe, to get any decent trapping. The Indians still the Indians still hunt here, don't they?" Matt asked. "The Indians mostly cleared out these parts," Ben told him. "What wasn't killed off in the war got took with the sickness. A deal of 'em moved on to Canada. What's left makes a mighty poor living. Game getting so scarce." "Where do they live?" "Round about." Ben waved vaguely off towards the forest. "They make small camps for a while, then move on. The Penobscots stick like burrs, won't give up. They still hunt and trap. No way to stop 'em. Never got it through their heads they don't still own this land. You never seen none of 'em." "My father did once. Do they speak English?" "Enough to get what they want. They pick it up from the traders. What pelts they can scrap together they take into the towns. They can strike a sharp deal. You got to know how to handle 'em. Reason you ain't seen 'em," he went on. "They got enough sense to clear out of these parts when the bugs is bad. They move off, the whole lot, down to the coast to get a year's mess of clams. Should be moving back 'bout now. They'll stay in the summer, then head off to the big hunt come fall. Them hunts," he remembered, "ain't nothin' like them nowadays. Bows and arrows was all they had. Still use 'em some, if they can't lay hands on a gun. I was deemed near as good as any of 'em. Don't suppose I could hit a barn door now." Ben's voice drawled on, thickened with food and drowsiness. He told of big moose hunts of his days and the Indians. He had fought in a recent war against the French, and he despised them for stirring up the Indians against the main settlements. He seemed to have single-handedly shot down half the French army. Especially he hated the Jesuit priests who had egged the redskins on, and he had once been part of an expedition that broke into a chapel and smashed the popish idols. Once he had been taken captive by the fierce Iroquois, who were set on putting him to torture, but he had been too smart for them and escaped in the night. Listening, Matt couldn't make the man out. To hear him talk, he had been as big a hero as Jack the Giant Killer, but he didn't look the part. He had certainly fallen on hard times of late, no doubt about it. However, he could tell a good story. The man's voice was trailing off, and he slumped lower and lower. Presently he was sprawled flat on the floor and snoring. It was clear enough that he could bed down anywhere. At least he hadn't taken over Matt's bed. Matt moved about quietly, though he doubted anything could disturb his guest. He cleaned off the bowls with his twig brush, then he banked the fire with ashes. But he couldn't sleep. He lay staring up at the log roof, even after the last flickers of firelight had died away and the cabin was in darkness. He couldn't quiet his uneasy thoughts. Bragging about his adventures by the fire, Ben had seemed harmless, just a fat, tired old man grateful for a good meal. To be honest, Matt had enjoyed his company. Now he began to worry. How long was Ben going to stay? He was sure to find out soon that Matt was living alone. When he did, would he decide it was more comfortable here than an Indian village? At the rate he had wolfed down that supper, the flour and molasses wouldn't hold out long. Would he expect Matt to go on providing meals and waiting on him? And why had he left that town on the river in such a hurry? Was there really some charge against him? Was he dangerous? Perhaps even a murderer? At that thought, Matt sat up on his pine bed. He'd be sensible to stay awake and on guard. He'd half a mind to fetch down his father's rifle and keep it near at hand. Then he felt ashamed. What would his father say about begrudging a stranger a meal and a night's sleep? All the same, he was determined not to shut his eyes that night. He kept them open long He kept them open a long time, but suddenly he jerked out of a deep sleep and saw the daylight was streaming across the cabin floor. The cabin door was open and the man was gone. Perhaps he only stepped outside. Matt stumbled to the door. No sign of the stranger. Relief flooded over him. All that worrying, and the man had never intended to stay. Perhaps he had actually believed the lie that his father was returning that day. Once again, Matt felt ashamed. He must have made it only too plain that Ben wasn't welcome. Would Pa say he had done wrong? Still, it was too early to be sure. At any moment Ben might appear, hungry for breakfast. He had better stir up some fresh corn cake. It was then that he noticed his father's rifle was not hanging over the door. In a panic, he searched the cabin, his own bed, the corner shelves, under the table, and the stools. He rushed back to the door and on the edge of the forest. It was no use. No way of telling which way the man had taken or how long he had been on his way while Matt slept. Ben was gone, and so was the rifle. He should have kept it in his hands, as his hunch had warned him. He could see now that the man had had his mind set on that gun from the moment he laid eyes on it. But even if Matt had had it in his hands, could he have held out against those burly arms? To keep his gun, could he actually have shot a man, even a criminal? It was only later, when his rage began to die down, that he felt a prickle of fear. Now he had no protection, and no way to get meat. Sick with anger, he had sat staring at the row of notched sticks. It would be a month at least before his father returned, a month of nothing but fish. And what would his father say?